So our next speaker, Jilayne Lovejoy, I mean, that's probably the most intriguing subject for a presentation we've ever had at Connect, right? An open source developer and a lawyer walk into a bar. I mean, you think, is this going to be like a comedy routine? Or? I wouldn't count on it. OK, well, thank you for joining. It sounds really interesting.
Thanks so much for having me. This is really an honor. So an open source lawyer and a developer walk into a bar. I'm guessing you're all anxiously waiting for a punchline. The truth is, I'm terrible with these kinds of jokes, so I asked for a little help from my friends, which was quite forthcoming, as you can see. I'll give that a second. This is my favorite one. And I think this one was the best, because sometimes it feels like that. Because the very nature of open source brings lawyers and developers together, sort of whether we like it or not. And I think there's a few reasons for that. First of all, open source software puts the license in front of developers in a way that I think is kind of unique if you think about it as compared to working on proprietary code. The license is right there. You sort of can't help but read it, and you kind of have to engage with it. And the other reason on sort of the other side is, as a lawyer, you really have to understand some of the technical aspects in order to kind of give good legal advice. So you've got to engage with your developers, understand what's going on, especially when it comes to things like license compliance. But the most important reason, I think, is that open source licenses are what enables collaboration. I don't think that Linux would be where it is today if it wasn't for the GPL. I don't know how many people agree with that statement. OK, not as many as I thought, but maybe you're still asleep. Open source licenses are built on copyright law. That's what gives back the rights to copy, distribute, modify, and redistribute. And so that's really a cornerstone kind of underpinning all that great collaboration that happens. But nevertheless, sometimes it feels a little bit like this picture. And so I thought I'd talk about some things I've learned along the way, sometimes lessons learned the hard way, on how we can all do our jobs better. Now, every lawyer's talk is supposed to have a disclaimer. Actually, that's not true. That's totally ridiculous. But a little bit of a warning. I might say some things in the next 25 minutes that might sound familiar, maybe a little holding mirror up. You may have done them. That's OK. Like I said, these are lessons learned. So the idea is just to have like an open and honest thought and conversation about how we can do better. So I'll get started. I'll start by picking on lawyers. So lawyers need to learn and listen. A lot of lawyers come into this space without any real background in open source. It's not like they train you on that in law school, last I checked. And so you really need to take the time to sort of trust and ask a lot of questions of your developers, because they're using open source software because of efficiency and all this great code that's available. And you really need to kind of engage with that and learn about that. And it will take you sometimes in some really murky areas of copyright and even patent and trademark law. And developers need to have respect. I know it's really easy to pick on lawyers. I know there's a whole body of jokes. I've heard all of them. When I went to law school, I was like, OK, it's time to get some thick skin. And there's some good reason for some of those jokes. But I have seen some pretty egregious comments about lawyers in public forums by even some pretty influential people that I thought, wow, I wonder what it would be like if those tables got turned. It probably wouldn't go over very well. And in this day and age where more and more projects are implementing code of conduct, I think we can all kind of like take that advice and expand it to not just the people you're working with on the code itself. Lawyers. Don't send a developer to do a lawyer's job. This is actually a title of a talk that Simon Phipps gave at FOSDEM a few years ago with a really great story. I just went back and watched it the other night about a poor developer in the an Apache project where clearly some lawyer was sort of asking the developer to ask for certain changes to the Apache CLA. You can imagine how well that went over. And there's a whole bigger, longer story about how you engage with the community, obviously, or not. But I always try to remind myself this because I think it's sometimes hard to sort of decide when you should sort of engage as a lawyer and when you should step back. And it's a really important distinction. And I think if when you start to get into sort of heavier legal stuff, just giving a developer sort of a message to send is not fair to the developer, and usually doesn't yield good results either because things get lost in translation. So lawyers need to jump in when it's the right time and don't just sort of hang in the background all the time. So developers, legal answers are just not satisfying to engineers. I can't tell you how many times I've just seen the look on people's faces or even heard the dead silence on the phone of just like the wheels are turning and you're looking for that really awesome answer because you guys are problem solvers and it's just not there in the form that you want it to be, and it's sort of like this, but why? And especially if you're from as a lawyer from a common law jurisdiction, you hear a lot of terms like it's a case-by-case scenario, it's a fact-based analysis, it's the totality of the circumstances. I like that, throw that one around in regular life. And in other words, it's not black and white. And I know this is really, really annoying to engineers, but I don't have great advice other than you just have to accept that. When your lawyers give you a fuzzy answer or we say it depends, it doesn't mean that we don't know what we're talking about. That is actually the way it works. And if you really think about how the law works, that's not always a bad thing. But and especially in open source, we don't have a lot of case law and a lot of precedent, so it is pretty gray sometimes. That being said, one of my developers made a really good point to me when I was preparing this, and he said, and he was someone I'd worked with a lot, and he said, sometimes we're just afraid because it's all kind of scary, and if you're just patient, you realize that the answers or the place you need to get to is usually kind of common sense. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, there's some parts that just don't make sense at all, and there's nothing you can do, but usually you can sort of come to a pragmatic outcome. All right, lawyers. Know what a source tree looks like. Know where the licenses are, know what notices look like. This helps tremendously. And learn about GitHub. I mean, I think GitHub is the most commonly used platform today. It's got a really easy web UI. Even I can use it, that says a lot. And it really is gonna help to know what your developers are dealing with and sort of what that looks like. And if you are brave enough to just try to do a pull request, even then you don't know what you're doing, you may actually get professions of love and admiration, because as I like to say when it comes to lawyers in this space, low expectations are easy to exceed. Okay, developers. So this sort of goes hand in hand with the other comment I made about the law not being black and white. So, and I didn't know how to best, there's a lot of ways I could say this, but legal advice tends to be kind of specific. So it goes back to that, sort of fact by fact or case by case fact-based scenario. And it's really hard because sometimes I know I'll say something and then, maybe 4 months from now, I'll hear someone be like, well, Jilayne said, blah, 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 blah. And I'm kind of going, well, that was a little bit of a different scenario. And so, there's general knowledge and that you can learn. And I'm a big proponent of training, as many of you will know. And I think actually all software developers should have some basic understanding of IP law. It makes all of us easier to communicate. But a lot of times legal advice is going to be specific to the scenario, and it may also be specific to you or your situation or your company, which means that you don't necessarily go run out and tell everybody else. This is what my lawyer told me. So, and if you're not sure where that line is, then you can always ask. Lawyers don't always be the naysayer. So legal education is really good, at least my experience of it as a US lawyer, at teaching you how to think through every worst possible case scenario to the worst outcome ever. And this is actually a really useful skill in, I think, in business as well as just as well as looking for legal risk, because we're really good at like poking holes and like, well, why do you want to do that? Are you sure you want to do it that way? Is that the best way to do it? This is not always a skill that's welcome at home, FYI. But it is useful. But we need to just remember that engineers don't want to hear no for an answer. And it's a really interesting thing I always remember when I was early in my career as a lawyer at a pretty prestigious large technology company, was talking about lawyers coming into in-house from law firms, and kind of a different approach when you're in a law firm. And he said that they have a really hard time saying yes. They kind of just want to say no, because someone's hiring you to look at all the legal risks. You're going to be doing all that sort of poking holes and so forth. And it stuck in my head, because I think sometimes no is the answer, but it's better to just take the approach of okay, how do we figure out how to do this? How do we get to the right place and minimize the risk and find a path to yes, obviously where that's appropriate. Developers. Does everybody know what these letters stand for? Let me fill you in. I am not a lawyer. How many people have maybe written these at some time? I find they are always followed by this word. And then the ... is usually a collection of maybe some accurate legal information mixed in with total misconstrued ideas and, I don't know, your uncle. Just kind of a mess. So this would just be good. And that's all I'm going to say about that. So if there's a theme from all of this, or at least the theme that I came up with, is I think we need to just all think about when to lead, when to follow, or when to just get out of the way. And that goes for sort of both sides, if you will. Sometimes as lawyers, we need to take a stronger lead, and we've seen some actually examples of that, with Jeff talking about the GPL cooperation commitment as being a great example. Sometimes we just need to follow, and sometimes you just need to get out of the way. And it goes the same for developers. And I think the other thing that's sort of more of a subtext is there's always a bigger context. And sometimes you don't know what it is, and sometimes you need to be informed, and sometimes you just aren't going to know, but it's there. And just sort of being aware of that, I think, always helps, that there may be other things going on, whether it's on the development side and deadlines and goals that have to be met, or on the legal side, there may be other things brewing that aren't necessarily ready or to be talked about, but there is always a bigger context. So there was a bunch of other things I wanted to put on these slides that didn't fit nicely into this like lawyer and developer category. So I've got sort of this sort of general stuff for organizations. I figure organizations are where we come together. And like I said, this didn't fit into much of a category, so it's a bit of a mishmash. But stop the CLA madness. Does everyone know? Does everybody know what CLA stands for? Contributor License Agreement. And I should note that I'm highly generalizing. Contributor license agreements are essentially just a different license for the inbound license, or for the license for the contributions coming into the project, as opposed to the license that's used for going out. They can vary quite a bit. And so, like I said, I'm generalizing, but it's important to know that they can vary, because that's actually burns a lot of lawyers' time. And this is like a whole talk in and of itself. I actually spent quite a bit of time chatting about this recently with some other lawyers. But what's been interesting to me is there was a period, I think there's sort of a pendulum swing if you go back, way back to the history of open source on the use of CLAs. And some years ago, I probably have a talk from like 6 years ago, like, yeah, people are starting to not use CLAs and go to inbound, outbound, and isn't this great? And then just recently, I've seen more, and I found this quite concerning. And I think there's a number of potential theories of why that is. But one reason I think I see is that there's more automation to make it sort of easier to sign a CLA, so I don't necessarily think this is a good thing. And I've seen some engineers, wanting to solve that problem and kind of going, oh, we've got this great solution for signing CLAs. And I was like, did you even talk to a lawyer about what the legal requirements are for that? And why are you doing this anyway? Don't make it easier. So, I mean, the bottom line is, at least for me, is if you're going to use a CLA, know why you're using it, have a reason, and then implement it in a way that actually realizes that reason, because I think sometimes that's not really being done either, which just, stop and think. And that goes, obviously for lawyers, but I think companies as well. And otherwise, just use the inbound, outbound model with the developer certificate of origin sign-off. And if you can't figure out a good reason why the CLA is better than that, then see first point. So this might be preaching to the choir, but open source is free and open, and I feel like I've seen just recently some interesting developments, usually some kind of creative licensing terms added to other open source licenses or what have you that aren't open source. I think this is really unhelpful and really dangerous. We have definitions. We have the 4 freedoms from the Free Software Foundation, and we have the open source definition from the OSI. If you haven't read either of those in a while, because we probably all take them for granted, it might be a really good time to kind of remind yourself of what it means. But these have become codified. These have become accepted in the world we sort of work under, which is a really good thing. I think it's, I hope anyway, less likely that we're having the argument of what is open source. So when someone comes up with something that sort of sounds like it's open source or tries to adopt that or uses a name that's kind of familiar but not quite, I think us as the community needs to call that out and say, no, you can do that. You can do another licensing model. Lots of other licensing models are around. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to charge money for something, that's fine. Just don't call it open source. Or if you're going to restrict certain people or certain things. So I think it's up to us to make some noise, to call that out and say, yeah, you can do that, but call it something else. Similarly, we should be engaging with the community. Again, this seems like a no-brainer, but I was thinking about this recently because I gotten together with some attorneys in this space, and I was feeling incredibly thankful at the knowledge that I've gained from sort of the people who have been doing this longer than me, and kind of starting to realize that now I've been doing this so long that it's sort of my responsibility to share that knowledge as well. And I've just seen a surprising amount of new people coming in that have lots of enthusiasm and great intentions, but maybe just a little bit too much misplaced confidence. And if you have a new and great idea, obviously you want to share it, and we don't ever want to squelch that, but you might want to ask, because someone actually might have thought of that before. And anyway, I mean, just barring just saying respect your elders, which would sort of sound like a totally grumpy old lady, I just think there needs to be, we need to help people kind of see that, and people come in, we want to encourage new blood, but again, make sure that people understand that, you also have to earn your dues, which kind of directly relates to that, my previous slide. But I think, again, it's sort of on us to sort of help people understand sort of, that there is already an open source definition or, what have you. So I think this has gotten better, but I still think a lot of companies struggle with sort of how to value open source. I mean, I don't think there's a technology company out there today that doesn't completely rely on open source. This should be sort of obvious. And then, you've seen companies that aren't even really software or technology companies in the way we normally think of it that do software. And now they have to and then they're doing software, so, they're doing open source. And, but I think when companies and business people try to put it into the neat little boxes of resources or dollar signs or bottom line, it gets a bit challenging. And then as a result of that, the people who do open source sometimes are not valued or treated like they're replaceable. And I know, you know, if you're a kernel maintainer, I mean, that's like, you don't find those people lying around, right? So we need to really make sure that that's valued. I think there's a book a few years ago called The New Kingmakers. I think it's still relevant today. I think it was from like 2012. So if software developers are the new kingmakers, then open source software is certainly part of that royalty. And I would say then the lawyers that support you are also sort of in the family. and that should be valued. I'm going through this way too fast. So finally, I think we need to facilitate diversity and inclusion. I think this is like a big hot topic. And the reason that I wanted to bring it up here was I'd never been to Linaro Connect before, and I was looking through the photos of the last one. And I was just looking through them for some random reason, like looking for photos of certain people I know in fuzzy unicorn outfits. But what struck me was how few women were here. I mean, it was like, I wasn't trying to think about it, and it struck me, and I thought that's, you know, really unfortunate. And then that made me think about all these numbers you see about the lack of women in STEM subjects and lack of women in software, and then it's even worse in open source. I mean, I don't know if you guys saw, not too long ago, GitHub did a survey, I think it was like 5,500 people over 3,800 projects, and 3% of them were women. That is horrific. And diversity is much more than gender, obviously, but as a woman myself, it's something I can speak to. I've been to a lot of these conferences. I'm always outnumbered. It's something we need to work on. And I think there's more conversations about that, and there's more programs, and you know, that is not something that changes overnight. It's sort of a slow change, but it's really good to see that. But I'd like to leave you all with a challenge, and that your next time you come here, you do something to help someone who wouldn't normally come, or might not know about this, or might not know how to get here, and help them make it happen. Because I didn't put encourage and I didn't put support. The only way these things change is if everybody makes it part of their DNA to change it. So, thanks. So, an open source developer and lawyer walk into a bar, and my non-funny punchline would be that they grab a drink of their choice, and they have a chat and say cheers. Thank you very much.